the 9 and 4. Welcome to the library, where today we continue our explorations of the realms of Jam'mar by looking at 2 more of the Analar tragedies. This entry shall cover the tragedies of Innocence and Avarice, and continues our examinations from a previous entry. I am the recorder, and as both the perceptive patrons and regular visitors of the library are more than aware, but for our new guests, I will remind one and all that this is just a brief look and introduction to these storied and still extant legends of the realms. To refresh everyone on the Analar tragedies in brief, they are a collection of Analar that by their actions expose some great truth, or better said, uncovered some trait or quality of the Analar and their power, known as grace, and are now the example and still extant proof of that lesson. We have previously discussed the tragedies of ignorance and hubris in an earlier entry, and through those tales we have learned that even possessing the ability to shape reality does not prevent the consequences of a lack of knowledge or of misplaced pride. In this entry we continue with the tragedies of Innocence and Avarice, 2 tales of loss and transformation of the Analar involved. One for reasons of faith and panic, while the other being for reasons of spite and egotism. Both tales are less often spoken of than the previous examples given, as these tales shine a decidedly less than beneficial light on the Analar. One could easily argue, for example, that the tragedy of ignorance was a tale of self-sacrifice, and that the tale of hubris was merely the victim of his own curiosity. But with these tales, we find only sadness, or naked and pitiable anger and hate. Beginning with the tragedy of Avarice, we find this tale actually is centered in the Second War of Feather and Scale, and particularly focused on the few moments after the 36 seconds of judgment. As such, this tale is far more contemporary than any of the other tragedies known, and shows how the Analar are willing to still learn new lessons, even ages after it may have been taught. For you see, while the events of the tale are centered on that moment in the far-off past, knowledge and understanding of it has only come in the last age, and only become to be properly understood at a high cost. During the 36 seconds of judgment, every Analar on the surface of Jam'mar, or within a mile of it, was stripped of the vast portion of their grace and power by the avatar of the 9 Wings, as punishment for their various crimes against the dragons in creating the Dragwa, and against the 9 Wings himself by their actions in sealing away the celestial elements. In 36 brief seconds, millions of Analar, well over half of the population remaining at that time in fact, were stripped of their reality bending and shaping powers, with a large portion of those, including most of the existing leadership of the Analar, being transformed into Man'ari for their particular involvement with the Dragwa project. The aftermath is well known in history. The Dragwa formed their own structure and nation, and the now ground-bound Analar mostly went to ground and hid, using the little power they had left to hide far from any who would come after them. One question went unasked for all the years between that time and the early years of the Age of Stars. What happened to all that grace? Most merely assumed it was repossessed by the Nine Wings, but it was not, as events would reveal much, much later. Why it didn't just return to the Nine Wings is not understood. Perhaps the intervention of Avarice is the only reason it was not so. Whatever the reason, when all that power and grace was excised from its original owners, the Analar First, now known as the Tragedy of Avarice, used his own grace to capture and add it to his. It did not go well for him, as that much power in one place was too much, even for an Analar First. It is not known how long it took from the capture and absorption of the grace to his bodily detonation, but it was a long enough few moments for the Tragedy of Avarice to attempt to portion off parts of his now overcharged self in an attempt to spread out the power. If this would have worked or not is an academic discussion, as the cracks created by the attempt became the fault lines that tore him asunder. In the end, it is said that the remains of Avarice recondensed into 13 fragments, each becoming a lesser copy of Avarice with the vast, if fractional, power of the whole. However, the mind capable of governing the power with any finesse was so thoroughly degraded it was beyond hope, merely by the experience of the attempt. For the rest of the War of Feather and Scale, and after Out Amongst the Stars, there were regular incidents involving the attempt to capture or resist one or more of these copies. Although it is very important to understand that no one understood or knew what these super powerful monsters were, only they were causing havoc before disappearing. Each of these encounters often went quite badly until just before the end of the Wars of Feather and Scale, when it is said one of the copies was burned to ash by a Manaree wielder of the Blue Flame in service of Domnitra. And this event saw the remainder of the copies all but vanish from Jam'mR's records. Of course, they had just fled into the stars, and would in time see themselves eventually hunted down and overwhelmed by the power of the elder gods of the Scriptorum, and saw 9 of their number rendered into nothing more than power sources for the 9 great Expedus-class ships of the ancient empire, where they remained until the end of the Scriptorum War. 3 of the others were reshaped into elite warriors that could tap into that infinite well of power that still connected all of the copies, while the totality of them were bound and under the eternal control and command of a very special book, crafted by the Scriptorum expressly for this purpose. With these warriors and the power they wielded, the Scriptorums had champions on pars with the likes of the Wrecking Crew that could never die or be destroyed, so long as the book remained safe. And for thousands of years, this was the status of the Tragedy of Avarice, merely a tool of the Scriptorum. That is, until the Age of Stars and the Scriptorum conflict that occurred. During the ending days of the conflict, a powerful human wizard, wielding blue flame with a skill or power only matched by the Emperor himself, rose to a not insignificant amount of fame by getting his hands on the control tome, which held that connection of power and dominion over all of Avarice's powers, including the warriors. This changed everything for the ancient empire, as it meant their power plants of their most powerful vessels were at risk, and it is thought to be one of the most compelling reasons for the rapid ending of the war. This human was, in fact, the reincarnation of the copy of Avarice, which was burned to blue cinders in the ancient past. It would seem that it was the flame's aspect of endurance and rebirth, otherwise known as the flame of the necrotai, that was used to defeat the copy. And as a result, the copy was reborn, but in such a way that the power flowing through him and connected to him was just a natural part of who he was, and thus not a strain or an encumbrance to him. By getting a hold of the book, he became whole in spirit and in touch with the fullness of his power, while not being at any risk of being destroyed by it, as his old self had. However, he lacked the memories or the mindset of the Analar that had started all of this, ultimately seeking only to end the threat of the Scriptorum War and becoming whole in the process. The fact that if not for the insistence of the wise and the powerful, he would have just returned to his chosen place of living and resumed being a pillar of that community, lending his aid whenever and wherever possible. This, along with the undeniable truth that he is not in any way the Analar first who had sought the power that was stolen from his own people for his own greedy gain. This illustrates beyond a doubt that even the tragedy of avarice was not beyond redemption. Yet, it also shows what the cost of what a redemption might be for those Analar that may attempt to once again in the future collect onto themselves a portion of power that the Nine Wings never intended for them. Thus, while no longer having the form or grace of his original self, the tragedy of avarice is still considered as a member of the Analar, and an honored one at that, even if he now serves in the very position as the Manaree who so long ago granted him his rebirth as a human and master of the blue flame. Moving on to the only one of the tragedies to not make an appearance in any of our tales so far, the Tragedy of Innocence is in many ways the total opposite of our previous tale, the Tragedy of Avarice, where avarice was one made into many by his own dark desires and lust for power. Innocence is many that became one by their blind faith and trust. As with the majority of the tragedies, Innocence's tale is from the time before time, and the early years of the firstborn generations of the elders. On what was essentially a field trip, a group of Analar children and their chaperone were visiting the surface of Jam'mar, and they saw a ship on the water. The children were both curious and desired to ride on the clever creation. Details of whether it was a river ferry, a fishing boat on a lake, or even some sort of ocean-going vessel are unclear and vary, with Innocence itself unclear on the facts of the matter. But in the end, the details are unimportant. What is agreed on is that they did indeed get to ride on the boat, and to the delight of all involved by all accounts. The owner of the vessel was delighted and honored to host the elders, and the children were enthralled by the ship and its function. For hours they sailed, and were of good spirit, and excited to experience such a new thing. Then, once more, the accounts differ, and the events that led to the death of the captain, crew, and the chaperone are varied and unclear. A dragon or other monster attacking is among the leading theories, as is the chance of some freak accident or weather event. Once more, in the end, the result was the same. The adults were dead, the ship was sinking, and the children were trapped in the vessel that they knew would keep them safe from the water, but panicking at the entire situation unfolding, as children understandably would. This is where I must inform, or perhaps remind you, that an Analar's powers of reality bending, their grace, is fully active from birth, and it is only the suppressing of that power by their parents, or those supervising them, that keeps disasters happening from every childish tantrum or overwhelmed exasperation that youths often find themselves experiencing. Before this point, this was just done as a reasonable practice and not really given that much consideration. After the ship vanished in an explosive flash of light, and the Analars themselves came to investigate the strange burst of grace energies, this practice became law, and new methods of protecting the young from themselves were readily and quickly devised. What the children had done was, via their grace, become one with the ship that would keep them safe forevermore, and while moving away from the danger instinctively, reforged and reformed the vessel. Soon, stories and tales of a strange ship of differing shapes and sizes sailing the rivers and the lakes of Jam'mar began to be told. And indeed, the tragedy of innocence had taken to sailing random waters, always happy to provide transport to those that were polite and kind to the ship. Those that boarded and tried to command or take over for themselves would see themselves become part of the ship and part of the crew. Their skills and knowledge of the seas and areas around saved, while the rest would be left to the waves. Many are the tales of the ship conversing in light and joyful tones, happily claiming, "I'm a ship," before taking those encountered where they needed to go. The minds of the children merged and melded into a singular consciousness, but still with small remnants or perspectives of the children's previous selves, leading to much confusion as a question may get several different and equally earnest and honest answers. Another effect of the merge was that Innocence was able to learn by absorbing meanies, expanding their knowledge of seacraft and related matters. These skills will become intuitive to Innocence, and while still having a technically perfect memory, Innocence is permanently of the naive and wide-eyed childlike mindset it has always been from the moment of its creation, often needing a bit of prompting to remember a matter of complex or intricate nature, but once prompted, doing so flawlessly. While on matters of the water or games, Innocence is nigh unflappable and nearly uncontestable. Most other subjects will confuse or just not be of interest to Innocence, and this can lead to Innocence going quiet, just conveying its passengers to their destination far quicker than normal, even for this preternaturally fast vessel. Particularly, questions about the accident or the events surrounding it will almost always evoke this reaction. However, there are those that have grown to have friendships and bonds with innocence over the ages. And this is where we get the few details we have from Innocent's perspective on the issues and events. As has been stated several times, the accounts are not clear, and really none expect children, even elder children, to be able to deal with constantly being brought back to the most traumatizing event in their lives. And as such, it is highly discouraged for those that know of Innocent's past from trying to pry further on the matter. This is vehemently enforced by those who have earned the vessel's trust and friendship. Notably in the current age, the leaders of Zero Brent on Jam'mar are among those who have earned this honor. The NLR initially tried to contain Innocence out of fear that it might become sour or cynical if left to sail the wider waters of Jam'mar, and thus becoming a real threat to the younger races that they would not be able to handle. However, no manner of mooring or magic could keep Innocence from being the best ship it could be, and ships move people safely across the water. The unbreakable certainty that formed Innocence in the first place also proved stronger than the efforts to contain it. And it was eventually understood that Innocence was not a danger to itself, and was able to still keep safe from threats that would otherwise take advantage of such a naive being. So, even to this day, the Tragedy of Innocence sails the waters of the realms, able to appear nearly anywhere there are good people with a need to cross the water safely, because that's what ships do. Numerous are the accounts of encounters with this being. Most are seen as a form of good omen or blessing on those gifted passage, as there are no tales or rumors of harm ever coming to those who are honored during the trip, and so honor the ship by being good guests. The Tragedy of Innocence is perhaps the tragedy that cuts the deepest for the NLR as a people, as in hindsight it was completely foreseeable, yet totally unpreventable, as the power of these firstborn generations and how to best and most safely manage them was a learning process in those early days. Ultimately, they failed to protect their own children from themselves. Bringing this point up in the presence of an NLR is a quick way to ensure a passionate reaction in almost any instance or setting, and is quite vehemently counseled against for anyone sane to ever consider doing, for any reason. Much more than a warning against the dangers of greed, or overconfidence, or of going into potential danger blind. The tale of Innocence is a caution to those that would bring forth such powerful and chaotic beings as children, and to ensure that not only are there reasonable measures taken for their safety, unreasonable ones should be considered as well, for life is often unreasonable, and often there are no second chances when things go badly. From greed to simple blind faith, we see the gamut of the motives and situations that are covered by the various tragedies of the NLR, as well as the lessons that they embody. Each has been an important step for the NLR to better know and understand themselves, even ages after their highest points. They have been seen there are still lessons to be learned. In this age of stars and the unknown, these lessons may prove vital in the challenges and obstacles that the NLR, as well as the wider realms, are sure to face as they ever expand more into the stars. I hope you've enjoyed learning about these analog tragedies, and perhaps have a better understanding of both them and how they would be an influence on not only the elder races, but of all of Jam'mR, as each and every one of them is still alive and active within the realms. Each is their own being and will play their part in the great production that is the passage of time within the realms of Jam'mR. Perceptive patrons, regular visitors, and of course, new guests of the library, I have been, as always, the Recorder, and I look forward to continuing our exploration and examination of the realms of Jam'mR with you in our next entry of Intro to the Realms. Thank you again for your time, interest, and of course, your support. And until you next make your way back to the library for another entry, by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves and each other. If you'd like to contribute to the further exploration and explanation of the realms, please consider leaving a comment, a like, and sharing the video around. I read all the comments and make efforts to reply to each. Thank you for helping to grow the channel, and know I look forward to each and every one of your comments. Other methods of support can be found in the channel's description. Thank you for watching,